It was a little past 10 p.m. when I finally settled into my new apartment. The walls still smelled of fresh paint, and boxes were scattered everywhere, half opened, waiting for the weekend to arrive so I could properly unpack. The building wasn't much to look at, but it was cheap, quiet, and close to my work. What more could I ask for? At least, that's what I thought when I signed the lease. The door creaked as I shut it, its old wood groaning under the weight of its age. I had just begun to brew a cup of coffee when I heard the first knock, a slow, deliberate sound that echoed down the narrow hallway. It wasn't an urgent knock, more like the kind you hear when someone's unsure if they should be disturbing you at all. I froze for a second, my hand hovering above the coffee pot. I wasn't expecting anyone. Cautiously, I approached the door. My old apartment had been on the ground floor, where the windows faced the busy street. I'd hear the constant hum of life passing by. This place, though, felt different, isolated. The door led into a dimly lit hallway that stretched for what seemed like miles. As I reached for the peephole, a strange sense of unease crept up my spine. Through the small, fisheye lens, I could see nothing but an empty corridor, the flickering fluorescent light casting eerie shadows on the worn carpet. My breath fogged the glass as I squinted, trying to discern any movement. Nothing. I hesitated for a moment longer before slowly unlocking the deadbolt and opening the door just a crack. The hallway was as empty as it had seemed. My heart was pounding harder than it should have been for such an innocuous situation. I shook it off, closed the door, and turned back to the coffee I hadn't finished making. Probably just the neighbors. I mumbled to myself. Another knock, this time louder. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. My eyes darted to the door. I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. Each beat a deafening thud as I crept back to the peephole, a pit forming in my stomach. Again, nothing. But this time, the silence that followed felt heavier, thicker somehow. It wrapped around me, filling the air with something unspoken, yet very present. I pressed my ear to the door, holding my breath. Was that breathing? My eyes widened, and I pulled back, heart racing uncontrollably. I knew what I heard. Someone know. Something was out there. My hand hovered over the door handle again, unsure of whether to open it or to leave it alone. But the sound of that breath was unmistakable. The knocking stopped. There was nothing for a long minute. I could feel the tension in my chest build up as I stood there, frozen. The sensation of being watched crawled under my skin. The quiet was maddening. Just as I turned to walk away, another noise cut through the silence. The doorknob rattled softly, not in an aggressive way, but as if someone was gently testing it. My heart felt like it would explode out of my chest. I could feel my breathing quicken, each inhalation jagged, forcing air in against the tight grip of fear. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. All I could do was stare at that door, praying it wouldn't open. It didn't. But something even worse happened. I saw a shadow move beneath the crack of the door. It was subtle, just a shift in the faint light seeping in from the hallway, but it was there, someone standing right outside. I slammed my back against the wall, my body rigid with fear. My fingers shook as they hovered near the lock, unsure if I should secure it or if the sound would alert whoever, or whatever, was out there that I was onto them. Then, without warning, the rattling stopped. Complete silence filled the air, heavy and unnerving. The shadow was gone. Slowly, cautiously, I inched back to the peephole, heart pounding as if it were trying to escape my chest. I looked. This time there was someone there, standing inches away from the door. Just outside the narrow lens of the peephole was a figure. I couldn't make out their face, but they were there, unmoving, just waiting, watching. I stumbled back, heart racing. What the hell was happening? That's when the whispering started. Low, garbled whispers seeped through the wood of the door. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone, it was wrong, unsettling. They weren't words meant for human ears. And then, all at once, the noises stopped again. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. My entire body was trembling. There was no way I was going to open that door now. I backed away, slowly retreating to the kitchen where my coffee was now cold. I fumbled for my phone, hands still shaking. As I unlocked the screen, ready to call the police, the phone slipped from my grip and clattered to the floor. Before I could pick it up, a soft knock echoed from the door again. My breath hitched. I froze, staring at the phone lying just out of reach on the floor, the screen still glowing faintly in the dim light of the kitchen. The soft knock echoed in my mind, a slow, deliberate reminder that whoever was out there hadn't left. My throat tightened, and I slowly sank to my knees, grabbing the phone with trembling hands. This time, the knock wasn't just a knock. It was a pattern. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 more, like a signal like they wanted me to respond. A chill ran through my veins, and my heart seemed to stop for a moment as I sat there, the phone in my lap, utterly paralyzed by fear. Whoever, or whatever, it was, they weren't going away. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel the sweat forming on my brow. Should I call the police? Would they even believe me? Someone's knocking at my door didn't exactly sound like an emergency. But this was different. Something about it felt wrong, like I was being lured into some twisted game. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Slowly, I stood up, gripping the phone like it was a lifeline. The silence pressed down on me as I approached the door again. Every step felt heavier than the last, the floor creaking softly under my weight as if the entire apartment was conspiring to betray my presence. I leaned in, pressing my ear to the door again. Nothing. No whispers this time. No rattling of the knob. Just stillness. I pressed my eye to the peephole, half expecting the figure to still be there, looming just outside. But the hallway was empty again, bathed in that same sickly fluorescent light. I should have felt relief, but instead, a deep sense of dread pooled in my stomach. The air felt thick, like something was wrong even if I couldn't see it. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my hand. The sound was jarring, breaking the fragile silence, and I nearly dropped it in shock. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced down at the screen. Unknown number. I hesitated for a moment, staring at the name on the display. My thumb hovered over the green button, debating whether or not to answer. The timing was too perfect. There was no way this was a coincidence. My heart hammered in my chest, urging me to ignore it, to let the call go unanswered. But before I could make a decision, the phone buzzed again. I answered it. Hello. My voice came out shaky, barely more than a whisper. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, I heard it, the same soft, deliberate knocks that had been haunting my door. But this time, they were coming through the phone, echoing in my ear. My blood ran cold, and I almost dropped the phone. I spun around, my eyes darting to the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. But it didn't. I couldn't move. My body felt like it had turned to stone, frozen in place by the sheer weight of my fear. Then, a voice crackled through the static on the other end of the line. It was low, barely audible, like someone whispering from the bottom of a well. I had to strain to hear it, but the words were unmistakable. Look through the peephole. I dropped the phone. It hit the floor with a dull thud, and the voice was cut off, but those words kept echoing in my mind. Look through the peephole. Look through the peephole. I didn't want to. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of the apartment, to run and never look back. But I couldn't move. Something was compelling me to look, to see whatever it was that was waiting for me on the other side of that door. Slowly, with a trembling hand, I reached for the peephole again. My breath caught in my throat as I pressed my eye to the tiny lens. At first, I didn't see anything. The hallway was still empty. But then, something shifted. It was subtle, like a shadow passing just outside my field of view. I blinked, trying to focus, and that's when I saw it. An eye. It was pressed up against the other side of the peephole, staring directly into mine. My heart stopped as I realized what I was looking at. Whoever was on the other side was standing impossibly close to the door. Their eye locked on mine, as if they'd been waiting for me to look. I stumbled back, gasping for breath, my chest tightening with panic. How long had they been there, just watching, waiting for me to get close enough to see them? The knocking started again, louder this time, more insistent. It felt like the sound was reverberating inside my skull, each knock sending shockwaves of terror through me. I backed away from the door, shaking my head, whispering to myself that this wasn't happening. And then, Just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Silence. But it wasn't over. I could feel it. The air was thick with tension, like something was still there, just beyond the door. I didn't dare approach the peephole again. I grabbed my phone from the floor, my hands shaking as I fumbled to dial 911. I was halfway through dialing when I heard it, a soft creak, like someone slowly turning the doorknob. I stared at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. The handle twisted ever so slightly, and I knew I had to move, had to run. But before I could do anything, the door began to open. The door creaked open a fraction of an inch, just enough to let the dim light from the hallway seep into the apartment. My entire body seized up with terror as I watched it slowly inch its way open. It felt like I was locked in place, unable to move, unable to think beyond the primal instinct to flee. But my legs wouldn't cooperate. For a moment, nothing happened. The door stopped just shy of fully opening, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was waiting, watching. My breath came in ragged gasps, and the pounding of my heart echoed in my ears, drowning out everything else. I stepped back slowly, my eyes locked on the narrow gap. Through the small opening, I could see part of the dimly lit hallway, empty and silent. But I knew something was there. I could feel its presence, heavy and suffocating. I took another step back, my heel hitting the edge of the kitchen counter. The knock had stopped, but the stillness was worse. It felt like the calm before a storm, a moment of breathless anticipation before something awful happened. I could feel eyes on me, even though I couldn't see them. I wasn't alone. In the eerie silence, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. Breathing. Shallow, rhythmic breaths. My skin crawled as I realized they weren't mine. Someone, or something, was standing just behind the door, watching me through the sliver of space. My pulse quickened, and I took another step back, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the door as possible. And then, slowly, a hand appeared in the gap. At first, it was just a few pale fingers curling around the edge of the door, as if testing the space. I gasped, covering my mouth to stop from screaming as the hand tightened its grip on the doorframe. The fingers were long, unnaturally so, with skin that looked almost translucent in the dim light. They moved with a strange, deliberate slowness, as if savoring each moment. The hand pushed the door open a little wider, revealing more of the hallway. But I couldn't see anything else. Just that hand, impossibly long fingers curling around the wood. And then it stopped. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, sending chills down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, mocking, sinister. The hand remained frozen in place, as if waiting for my next move. I stumbled backward, my feet tripping over the corner of a box. I fell hard onto the floor, the air knocked from my lungs as my back hit the cold tiles. The sound of my fall seemed to shatter the silence, and in an instant, the door was thrown wide open. I scrambled to my feet, my hands clawing at the kitchen counter as I pulled myself up. I couldn't bring myself to look directly at the doorway, afraid of what I might see. But in my peripheral vision, I could sense movement, slow, deliberate, and uncomfortably calm. Whoever or whatever had been behind the door was now standing in the entrance. I forced myself to turn, my entire body trembling with fear. The figure was tall, taller than any person should be. Its frame was unnaturally thin, and its skin was pale, almost gray, like it had never seen sunlight. It didn't move toward me. It just stood there, its head cocked to one side, watching me with a strange, unnerving stillness. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes drifted upward, locking onto its face, or what should have been its face. But there was nothing there, just a smooth, featureless surface, devoid of eyes, nose, or mouth. I gasped, stumbling backward into the counter. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but there was no explanation. This thing, it wasn't human. It couldn't be. The figure tilted its head a little more, as if considering me, like a predator sizing up its prey. The room seemed to close in around me, the air growing thick and heavy. I could feel my vision blurring as panic set in, My legs felt like they were made of lead, refusing to carry me away from the thing standing in my doorway. Then, with a movement so quick I almost missed it, the figure reached for me. I screamed, lunging to the side, just as its long, spindly fingers brushed against my shoulder. Cold sweat poured down my back as I bolted for the bedroom, slamming the doors shut behind me. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled with the lock, twisting it frantically until I heard the reassuring click. I backed away from the door, eyes wide, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. For a long moment, there was silence again, an unbearable, oppressive silence. And then the knocking started once more. Not on the front door, but on my bedroom door. Slow, rhythmic, deliberate. I backed further into the room, my heart racing as I searched for something, anything, to defend myself with. My eyes landed on the heavy lamp on my bedside table, and I grabbed it, holding it in front of me like a shield. The knocking continued, each tap of its fingers growing louder, more insistent. The handle on the door jiggled, and I could hear the faint, almost playful whispering coming from the other side. I pressed myself against the far wall, holding the lamp like my life depended on it. The handle rattled again, harder this time, and I knew it wouldn't be long before that thing was inside. Then all at once the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I strained to hear any movement, any sign that it was still there. My heart pounded in my ears, and I could feel the tension building in the room like a coiled spring. Suddenly, there was a soft tap at the window behind me. I turned slowly, dread filling my chest, knowing what I was about to see. There, standing just outside the window, was the faceless figure, its smooth head tilted as it watched me. A place with character. A big wooden porch, creaky floors, high ceilings, maybe even one of those winding staircases that feels like something out of an old movie. So when we found the place on the edge of town, tucked away on a quiet street, I didn't think twice. The price was a steal, the neighborhood was quiet, and it had all the charm I could ever want. I convinced my wife, Claire, that it was perfect for us. She hesitated at first, something about the house didn't sit well with her, but I chalked it up to nerves. Moving into a new home was always stressful. But from the moment we stepped through the door, I could tell she was uncomfortable. She kept looking around, like she was expecting something to be there that wasn't. The house was older than I'd expected, but I liked that. The wood had a rich, deep texture, the kind you don't get in modern places. But there was one odd thing about it that I didn't notice until after we moved in. The peephole. It was old, much older than the rest of the house. A small, brass fixture in the center of the door, slightly tarnished with age. At first, it didn't bother me. A peephole was a peephole, right? A little old-fashioned, sure, but nothing to worry about. Besides, the previous owner had mentioned how quiet the street was, how nobody ever came by except for the occasional delivery. The first night was uneventful. We unpacked a few boxes, ate takeout on the floor, and went to bed early, exhausted from the move. I slept like a rock, but Claire kept tossing and turning. She mentioned something about the wind rattling the windows, but I didn't hear it. I shrugged it off, telling her it was just the sounds of an old house settling in. The next night, things started to feel off. It was around midnight, and I was in the living room flipping through channels trying to wind down. Claire had gone to bed early, complaining of a headache. The house was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. That's when I heard it. A soft knock. It was so quiet at first, I thought I imagined it. I muted the TV and listened, holding my breath. There was again 3 soft, deliberate knocks. I glanced toward the front door, my stomach tightening with unease. Who the hell would be knocking at this hour? I got up slowly, my heart beginning to race. The hallway leading to the front door seemed longer in the dim light, the shadows stretching across the wooden floor like dark tendrils. As I approached the door, I hesitated for a second before leaning in to check the peephole. What I saw made my skin crawl. There was no one there. The street outside was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the single streetlight at the corner. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but otherwise the world outside seemed still, as though it hadn't been disturbed at all. A cold knot of anxiety twisted in my stomach, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a prank. kids from the neighborhood messing around. I opened the door and stepped outside, peering into the shadows. But the street was deserted. There was no sound, no movement, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. I locked the door, telling myself it was nothing, and went back to the couch. But as I sat there, staring at the TV, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, Claire noticed the tension. She asked if I'd slept okay, and I told her about the knocking. She didn't say much, but I could see the concern in her eyes. "Maybe it's just the wind," she suggested, trying to reassure me. "Old houses make weird noises." I nodded, even though I didn't quite believe it. That night, I went to bed early, hoping to sleep off the unease that had settled over me. I fell asleep quickly, but I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had stirred me from my dreams, but I didn't know what. The room was pitch black, and the silence was so thick it felt suffocating. I strained to listen, heart thudding in my chest. Then there was 3 soft knocks. I bolted upright, my breath catching in my throat. Claire stirred beside me, mumbling something in her sleep. I climbed out of bed as quietly as I could, my feet moving slowly toward the door. I didn't want to go, didn't want to check the peephole again, but something compelled me to do it. I crept down the hallway, the wooden floors creaking under my weight. My hand trembled as I reached for the peephole, and when I pressed my eye to it, I expected to see the same empty street from the night before. But I didn't. This time, someone was standing there. A man, or at least the shape of one, stood just beyond the threshold. I couldn't make out any details. His face was obscured in shadow, his body hidden beneath a long coat. He didn't move. He just stood there, waiting, as if he knew I was watching him. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What was he doing here? Why wasn't he saying anything? I ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. Claire sat up, startled. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice groggy with sleep. "There's someone outside," I whispered, my voice trembling. She stared at me for a moment, processing what I'd said. Then she got out of bed and followed me to the door. Together, we stood in the hallway listening, but there was nothing. No knocks, no footsteps, no sign that anyone had ever been there. "Are you sure?" Claire asked, her brow furrowed in concern. "I saw him," I insisted, my voice shaking. "He was standing right outside." We both stared at the door for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But the house remained silent. Finally, Claire grabbed my hand, pulling me away from the door. "It's late," she said softly. "Let's go back to bed. Maybe you just imagined it." But I knew I hadn't. I knew what I saw. As we lay in bed, my mind raced, replaying the image of that figure standing just beyond the door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Something was wrong with this house. Something lurking just outside the edges of reality. And I knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. The next morning, I woke up feeling exhausted. The unease from the previous night still clung to me, heavy and oppressive. Claire was already in the kitchen, making breakfast, and I could see the concern etched on her face as I joined her. Neither of us spoke much. There wasn't much to say. I couldn't shake the image of that figure, standing just outside the door, motionless, as if it were waiting for something. I didn't mention it again. Claire seemed to think it had all been in my head, a product of too little sleep and too much stress. I almost convinced myself that she was right. After all, I hadn't heard anything after those 3 knocks. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. The day dragged on, slow and uneventful. I kept finding myself glancing toward the front door, my heart jumping every time I heard a creak or a thud from somewhere in the house. It felt like something was waiting, biding its time. But what? I tried to distract myself with mundane tasks, unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, but nothing seemed to ease the growing tension in my chest. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. I didn't want to admit it, but part of me was afraid to be alone in the house after dark. Claire stayed up, reading a book, while I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. I didn't know what, but I could feel it coming. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was being woken up by a sound. Knock! Knock, knock. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I thought I was still dreaming. But the sound came again, 3 deliberate rhythmic knocks. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't coming from the front door this time. It was coming from inside the house. I sat up slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The room felt too quiet, too still. The knocks had stopped, but the air was thick with tension, like something was waiting for me to make the next move. I glanced over at Claire, but she was fast asleep, oblivious to the noise. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, my feet touching the cold wooden floor. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told me to stay in bed, to lock the door, and wait until morning. But something pushed me forward, an unshakable curiosity mixed with a sick sense of dread. I crept down the hallway, the darkness closing in around me. The old house creaked and groaned with each step I took, the faint light from the street outside casting long shadows across the floor. The air felt heavy, pressing in on me from all sides. My breath came in shallow gasps as I reached the living room, where the sound had come from. There, standing in the middle of the room, was the front door. It was wide open. My stomach dropped, and I froze, staring at the door. I knew I had locked it. I had checked it twice before going to bed, making sure the deadbolt was in place. But now it stood open, the night air spilling in like a thick, cold fog. I slowly approached the door, peering into the hallway beyond. The street was empty, the soft glow of the street lamp casting a sickly light over the pavement. There was no sign of anyone, no movement, no sound. Just the quiet, empty night. Then I heard it again, a faint whisper. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the peephole. I stood there, frozen, my eyes locked on that tiny, brass peephole. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, though I couldn't make out any of the words. My hands trembled as I slowly leaned forward, my breath hitching in my throat. I pressed my eye to the peephole. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. The hallway beyond was empty, silent. But as I stood there, staring through the tiny lens, something began to take shape. It was a face, pale, almost translucent, with wide, hollow eyes staring back at me. A scream caught in my throat, but no sound escaped. The face was pressed up against the other side of the door, too close, like it had been waiting for me to look. Its mouth was moving, forming words I couldn't hear, couldn't understand. I stumbled back, heart racing, my breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. The door remained open, the hallway empty, but I knew whatever it was still there watching. I slammed the door shut, twisting the deadbolt with shaking hands. For a moment, I leaned against the wood, trying to steady my breathing. But the whispering hadn't stopped. It was still there, muffled but persistent, coming from the peephole. I backed away slowly, retreating to the hallway. The whispering grew softer as I moved further from the door, but I could still hear it, like a low hum beneath the surface of everything. I stumbled back into the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. Claire stirred, rubbing her eyes as she sat up. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice heavy with sleep. I couldn't bring myself to answer. I just stood there, trembling, staring at the bedroom door. I knew that whatever had knocked the night before, whatever had opened the door tonight, wasn't going to stop. Not until it got in. The rest of the night passed in a blur of sleeplessness. I stayed awake, sitting at the edge of the bed, listening for any sound. The whispering eventually faded, but the unease stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Morning came too slowly, the light filtering in through the thin curtains like a promise of safety. Claire tried to talk to me over breakfast, but I couldn't focus. All I could think about was the night before, the face in the peephole, the way it had watched me like it knew something I didn't. And the worst part was I could feel it. Deep down, in the pit of my stomach, I knew it would come back. Tonight. As the day wore on, I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, afraid of the house, afraid of whatever was outside watching. I had to do something to figure out what was happening. That evening, as the sun began to set, I went to the hardware store and bought a new lock. One that wouldn't be easy to tamper with. I installed it as the shadows stretched across the room, glancing nervously at the door every few minutes. Claire sat on the couch, watching me with quiet concern. I hadn't told her everything, not about the face, not about the whispers. I didn't know how to explain it without sounding crazy. When the lock was finally in place, I tested it, pulling on the door to make sure it was secure. It seemed solid enough, and for a moment, I let myself believe that it would be enough to keep whatever was out there out. But deep down, I knew the truth. It wasn't the lock that was the problem. It was the peephole. G from behind the door again. The same low, garbled voice I had heard before, but this time it was clearer, more insistent. "Let me in." The word sent a shock of fear through my body. I jerked away from the peephole, my pulse pounding in my ears. My hand hovered over the lock for a moment, unsure of what to do. The urge to run, to get as far away from that door as possible, was overwhelming. But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, trapped between fear and curiosity. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I could hear it clearly now, as though the voice was speaking directly into my ear. "Let me in," it repeated, the words slithering through the air like poison. I backed away from the door, my hands trembling. I didn't know what to do. Call the police? Tell Claire? But what would I even say? That there was something outside, something that wasn't human, asking to be let in? They'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was. Then, without warning, the knocking started again. This time it wasn't soft. It was loud, forceful, like someone was pounding on the door with all their strength. Each knock rattled the door in its frame, and the whispering grew louder, overlapping with the sound of the pounding, creating a cacophony of terror. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the hallway rug as I scrambled to get away. My heart was racing, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. The knocking was relentless, shaking the walls, the sound vibrating through my bones. It felt like the house was coming apart, like whatever was outside was trying to force its way in. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. Silence fell thick and suffocating. I stood there, trembling, waiting for something else to happen. My chest heaved as I struggled to catch my breath, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. But the door remained closed, the hallway silent once more. For a long moment, I didn't move. I couldn't. My legs felt like lead, my body weighed down by fear. I could still hear the whispering, faint and distant now, like an echo fading into the darkness. But it wasn't over. I knew it wasn't. The door suddenly rattled again, but this time it wasn't the pounding of fists. It was the sound of the doorknob slowly turning. My heart leapt into my throat as I watched the knob twist, inching its way open. I rushed forward, grabbing the knob and twisting it back, locking the door with a trembling hand. But the force on the other side didn't stop. It kept turning, kept pushing, as if it didn't care that the door was locked. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, this time clearer, more urgent. I pressed my back against the door, my entire body shaking as I fought to keep it closed. The doorknob kept turning, the force behind it growing stronger with each passing second. My arms ached from the effort, my heart pounding in my chest like a jackhammer. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the pressure stopped. I slumped against the door, gasping for breath. The house was silent again, the whispering gone. But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. I stepped back from the door, my legs weak, and that's when I heard it. A faint tapping, not from the door, but from the window at the end of the hallway. I turned slowly, dread settling deep in my gut. The curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze, and beyond them, I could just make out the silhouette of a figure standing outside. It was watching me, and it was waiting. I moved into the apartment on a chilly autumn afternoon. The place wasn't much. A small one-bedroom with old wooden floors that creaked underfoot and windows that rattled with the slightest breeze. But it was mine, and after the last few months of couch surfing and living out of suitcases, that felt like enough. The rent was cheap, and the landlord seemed nice, if a little distant. He didn't say much when I signed the lease, just handed me the keys and mumbled something about how quiet the building was. I liked the quiet. After everything that had happened, I needed a fresh start, a place where I could put the past behind me and move on. I was ready for a new beginning. The first few days passed uneventfully. The apartment had that kind of stillness you don't really notice until you're alone. It was an old building, full of odd noises. Pipes groaning in the walls, floors settling, the occasional scurrying of what I hoped were mice in the attic. But I didn't mind. It was peaceful, in a way. There was, however, one thing about the apartment that made me uncomfortable from the start: the peephole. It wasn't like the modern ones you'd find in most doors. This one was old, brass, and slightly tarnished, like it had been there for decades, if not longer. And it wasn't just at eye level, it was much lower, positioned almost at chest height, as if it had been designed for someone significantly shorter than me. When I asked the landlord about it, he just shrugged and said, "Old building, old quirks." I didn't think much of it at the time, but there was something about it that bothered me. Maybe it was the way it looked, worn and a little too low. Or maybe it was the fact that every time I walked past the door, I felt a strange compulsion to look through it, like it was daring me to check what was on the other side. The first time I looked through the peephole, it was late at night. I'd been lying in bed, trying to sleep, but something had woken me up. I couldn't place what it was: a sound? A feeling? It was hard to tell. All I knew was that I suddenly felt uneasy, like something wasn't quite right. I got up, padded across the cold wooden floor, and walked to the front door. The hallway outside was silent, dark except for the dim glow of the overhead light at the far end. I stared at the door for a long time, my hand hovering over the knob, before finally leaning down to peer through the peephole. The hallway looked the same as always, empty, quiet. But the feeling didn't go away. Something was off. I couldn't explain it, but standing there in the dark, looking out into that empty hallway, I felt watched. I shook my head, pulling away from the door, telling myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was a quiet building. I'd barely seen any of the other tenants, and the landlord had said there were only a few people living here. I went back to bed, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me for the rest of the night. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't always there, but it came in waves, usually when I was alone in the apartment. I'd be cooking dinner, or watching TV, or brushing my teeth, and suddenly I'd get this sense that someone was standing just outside the door, peering in through that old brass peephole. One night it happened again. I had just gotten out of the shower, and as I walked through the living room, I felt a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like eyes were on me. I turned toward the door, heart pounding, and there it was again, that feeling. I stared at the door for a long time, debating whether or not to check the peephole. My pulse quickened, and I found myself hesitating, suddenly unsure if I wanted to know what was on the other side. But I couldn't resist. Slowly, I crept toward the door, my bare feet silent on the creaky floorboards, and leaned down to peer through the tiny brass lens. At first, the hallway seemed normal, empty as usual. The dim light at the end of the hall flickered slightly, casting long shadows along the walls. But just as I was about to pull away, I saw something. A figure. It was standing at the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the flickering light. My breath caught in my throat, and I blinked, unsure if I was seeing things. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a long coat, but its features were obscured by the shadows. I stared, frozen, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure didn't move. It just stood there completely still, as if it were waiting for something or someone. A chill ran down my spine, and I stepped back from the door, heart pounding. I glanced through the peephole again, but the figure was gone. The hallway was empty once more, the light flickering faintly above. I locked the door and backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones. That figure, it hadn't been a trick of the light. Someone had been standing there, watching me. The next few nights were quiet. Too quiet. I didn't look through the peephole again, no matter how tempted I was. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that I'd imagined the figure in the hallway. But I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me, thick and heavy like a storm cloud waiting to burst. Then one night, the knocking started. It was just past midnight, and I was lying in bed, drifting in and out of sleep, when I heard it, 3 soft knocks, barely audible but unmistakable. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there in the dark, listening. Knock! Knock! Knock. It was coming from the front door. I sat up slowly, my heart racing. For a long moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe, just listening to the silence that followed the knocking. The apartment felt suffocating, the air thick and stale. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came again, louder this time, more insistent. I threw the covers off and crept to the door, my hands trembling. I knew I shouldn't look, that I should leave it alone, but something drew me toward the peephole. I leaned down, pressing my eye to the small brass lens, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was back. It stood directly in front of my door, closer than it had been before. Its face was still hidden in shadow, but I could see more of its outline now, the long coat, the thin, almost skeletal frame. It was watching me, waiting for me to open the door. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The knocking came again, louder, more forceful. Knock, knock, knock. I backed away from the door, panic rising in my throat. Whoever it was, they weren't leaving. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I fumbled to dial 911. But before I could press the button, the knocking stopped. Suddenly, the apartment was silent again. Too silent. I crept back to the door, my breath shaky, and pressed my ear against the wood. I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. But then, the doorknob began to turn. The doorknob rattled softly at first, just a faint, tentative twist, as if whoever or whatever was on the other side was testing to see if it was locked. My heart pounded so loudly in my chest that I could barely hear anything else, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the movement. But then it happened again, more forceful this time. The door shook slightly in its frame, and I backed away, my hands trembling. The knocking had stopped, but now, whoever was out there was trying to get in. I stumbled back toward the living room, grabbing a heavy lamp from the side table, my only makeshift weapon. My phone was still clutched in my other hand, the emergency number on the screen, but I couldn't bring myself to press call. Something deep inside me knew that if I made a sound, it would hear me. I don't know how I knew this, but I felt it like a weight on my chest. The doorknob rattled again, and this time it twisted all the way, the latch clicking in the frame. My pulse quickened, and I held my breath, watching in horror as the door began to creak open. Just a crack at first, a sliver of light from the hallway slipping inside. And then it stopped. I waited, frozen, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the door to swing open completely. But it didn't. The gap remained just wide enough for a pair of eyes to peer through, if someone was tall enough. I glanced at the peephole, knowing full well that I didn't want to look through it. But something compelled me, the same twisted curiosity that had brought me to the door in the first place. I moved slowly, inching toward the door, my breath shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. I crouched down, pressing my eye to the peephole, half expecting to see nothing at all. But I was wrong. There, just beyond the door, a single, bloodshot eye stared back at me. It was wide, unblinking, too close to the peephole to be natural. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side was pressed right up against the door, watching me through the same lens I was using to watch them. I gasped, stumbling back from the door, my hands shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the lamp. The door creaked again, just a little wider this time, as if responding to my fear. Then a voice, low, raspy, almost a whisper. "Let me in." I froze, staring at the door, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was wrong, too soft, too distorted. It didn't sound like any human voice I had ever heard, but there was something in it, a kind of sickening familiarity that made my skin crawl. "Please let me in." The voice came again, more insistent this time, as if it was growing impatient. I shook my head, backing away from the door, the lamp gripped tightly in my hand. "No," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. "Go away." There was a pause, a long, tense silence where nothing moved, and I almost believed it had gone. But then, the door jolted violently in its frame, shaking so hard I thought it might burst open. I screamed, stumbling back into the living room, tripping over the coffee table and falling hard onto the floor. My phone clattered across the room, but I didn't move to grab it. I was too terrified to look away from the door. The rattling continued, the door shaking as if something was throwing itself against it. But somehow, it didn't open. The new lock I had installed was holding, at least for now. Then the voice came again, low and guttural, almost pleading now. "Let me in." I crawled backward on the floor, desperate to put as much distance between myself and the door as possible. My back hit the wall, and I sat there, trembling, listening to the sound of the door rattling and the whispers that seemed to seep through the wood like poison. Suddenly, the rattling stopped. For a moment, the apartment was deathly silent. I didn't move, my body tense, waiting for whatever came next. I strained to hear any sound, any sign that the thing outside was still there. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel my pulse racing, my body frozen with fear. And then I heard it. Soft footsteps, slowly retreating down the hallway outside. I let out a shaky breath, barely daring to believe it. Whatever had been outside had left, or at least that's what I wanted to believe. I forced myself to stand, my legs shaky and weak. I grabbed my phone from the floor and rushed to the door, locking the deadbolt tightly. For a long time, I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for the knocking or the rattling to return. But it didn't. The hallway was silent, as if nothing had happened at all. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind against the windows made me jump. I was on edge, convinced that at any moment, that thing would come back, that I would hear the knocks again or see that single bloodshot eye peering through the peephole. But the night passed without incident. Morning came, and with it a faint sense of relief. I almost believed it was over, that whatever had tried to get in had given up. I was wrong. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. I didn't see anyone else in the building, no neighbors, no visitors, nothing. It was as if the entire place had emptied out, leaving me alone with the memory of that voice, that eye staring back at me through the peephole. Then late one night, just as I was starting to let my guard down, the knocking came again. Soft at first. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, just like before. I stood in the living room, staring at the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't go to the door. I knew I shouldn't look through the peephole, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I approached the door, my hands trembling as I leaned down, pressing my eye to the tiny brass lens. What I saw made my blood run cold. The figure was back, standing in the hallway, just inches from the door. But this time it was different. Its face was visible now, pale and gaunt, with sunken eyes and skin that looked as though it had never seen the light of day. Its lips were twisted into a grotesque smile, and those same bloodshot eyes were staring directly into the peephole, unblinking. "Let me in," it whispered, its voice barely more than a breath. I stumbled back, heart racing, as the figure slowly raised a hand and placed it against the door. The doorknob began to turn once more. The doorknob twisted in slow, deliberate motions, each click sending a jolt of fear through my body. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, just stood frozen, watching the knob turn further and further, as if in some horrible, twisted dream. The figure outside didn't move. It just stood there, smiling that grotesque smile, its eyes wide and unblinking, locked on mine through the peephole. "Let me in," the voice whispered again, a soft, chilling murmur that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The words felt wrong, as if they didn't belong in this world, like they came from somewhere dark and far beyond understanding. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest, my legs barely able to support me. The apartment felt suffocating, the air thick with an unnatural weight, like the very walls were closing in. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but my voice was trapped in my throat. The doorknob twisted fully now, and I heard the soft, unmistakable click of the latch releasing. The door creaked open ever so slightly, just enough to let the faintest sliver of light from the hallway seep in. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back, barely able to stay on my feet as the door inched open wider. Then it stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The door hung there, slightly ajar, as if waiting for me to make the next move. The figure outside hadn't stepped in. It just stood there unmoving, watching me from the other side of the door. "Let me in." The voice came again, this time a low, guttural rasp that chilled me to the bone. The figure's hand moved slowly, its long, bony fingers curling around the edge of the doorframe, as if testing the space between us. I took another step back, my body trembling uncontrollably. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far away from that door as possible. But my feet felt like they were cemented to the floor, my legs too weak to carry me. The door creaked again, opening just a fraction more. I couldn't take it anymore. In a surge of panic, I lunged forward and slammed the door shut, twisting the deadbolt into place with trembling hands. My breath came in ragged gasps, and I pressed my back against the door, as if my weight alone could keep whatever was outside from forcing its way in. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. I stood there, shaking, my heart pounding in my ears, waiting for the knocking to return, or worse, for the door to burst open. But the hallway remained quiet. No more whispers, no more rattling doorknob. It was as if the figure had simply vanished, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of the apartment. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. I didn't move. I couldn't. Every muscle in my body was tense, poised for the next sound, the next horrifying moment. Then, slowly, I crept toward the peephole again, heart hammering, knowing I shouldn't look but unable to stop myself. I pressed my eye to the lens. Nothing. The hallway was empty. The figure was gone. I let out a shaky breath, my hands still trembling as I backed away from the door. Was it really over? I couldn't be sure, but the silence that followed felt too absolute, too final. I wanted to believe that it had gone, that whatever had been outside had given up, but something deep in my gut told me it wasn't that simple. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, every light in the apartment turned on, waiting for the next knock, the next whisper. But the hours passed without incident, and when the pale light of dawn finally crept in through the windows, I allowed myself a small sigh of relief. Maybe it was over. The next day, I tried to go about my life as normally as possible. I told myself it had all been some terrible hallucination, a trick of my mind brought on by stress and lack of sleep. I wanted to believe it had all been in my head, but the memory of that figure, the way it had stared at me, the way it had whispered, haunted me with every step I took. That evening, as the sun set and darkness began to creep back into the apartment, the familiar sense of dread returned. I tried to ignore it, focusing on small tasks, cleaning up, making dinner, but my mind kept drifting back to the door, to the peephole. I didn't want to check it, didn't want to look through it ever again. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting just beyond that door. The night passed uneventfully. No knocks, no whispers, just an eerie, unnatural quiet that made the apartment feel like a tomb. I stayed up as long as I could, afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. But exhaustion eventually won out, and I drifted off into a fitful, restless sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. Something had stirred me awake, but I didn't know what. The apartment was dark, the air still and heavy. I lay there for a moment, listening, trying to pinpoint what had roused me from sleep. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound, not at the door, but at the window. My blood turned to ice as I realized it was coming from the living room. Slowly, I sat up, my pulse racing. I crept out of bed, every step slow and deliberate, my breath shallow as I made my way toward the sound. When I reached the living room, I froze. The window was open, not fully, but just enough for a thin breeze to drift in, rustling the curtains. I stared at it, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I had locked it before going to bed. There was no way it could have opened on its own. Then, from behind me, I heard a soft, familiar voice. "Let me in." I spun around, eyes wide, and there was... The figure stood in the middle of the room, its grotesque smile stretching wider, those hollow, sunken eyes staring right through me. It was closer now, its pale, gaunt face illuminated by the faint light from the street outside. It didn't move, didn't speak again. It just stood there, waiting, and then it began to walk toward me. I backed away, my entire body trembling, my mind screaming for me to run, to get out. But the figure was relentless, its steps slow and deliberate, its eyes never leaving mine. I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the lock, but before I could open it, I felt its cold, bony fingers wrap around my wrist. "Let me in," it whispered, its breath hot and foul against my skin. And then everything went black. I woke up on the floor, the faint light of dawn creeping in through the window. The apartment was silent still. My heart raced as I looked around, half expecting the figure to be standing over me. But it was gone, or at least I thought it was. I staggered to my feet, my entire body trembling. Every part of me ached, and I could still feel the icy grip of the figure's hand on my wrist. I looked toward the door. The peephole. The brass glinted faintly in the morning light, and as I stared at it, a sickening realization washed over me. I wasn't alone. I crept toward the door, my hands shaking as I leaned down, my eye pressing against the tiny, tarnished lens. And through the peephole, staring back at me from the hallway outside, was the figure. Its face was twisted into that same grotesque smile, and its eyes locked onto mine, as if it had been waiting for me to look. And then it spoke again, its voice low and guttural, barely more than a whisper. "Let me in." I slammed my back against the door, heart pounding in my chest, knowing that no matter what I did, no matter how many locks I installed, it would always be there, waiting, watching, and one day it would find a way in. Hey there! Don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Thank all of you.